All right, so this is a quick video on, forgive my United States, that's about as bad as it gets, I know. We are going over the churches, the evolution of the churches in the United States, colonial United States, and then we're going to talk about the Great Awakening. So just quickly, we're going to do this. So, colonial times, there's something called the established church. If a church is established, the established church is churches supported by taxation. So if colonial taxes, some of it goes to supporting a church, it's called the established church. There's two types of established churches, the Church of England and the Congregational Church. The Church of England is also known as the Anglican Church and the Congregational Church. The Congregational Church is the New England region. Region equals the Congregational Church, okay? The Church of England, or the Anglican Church, is established in the Virginia colonies, okay? This is established in the Virginia colony. You guys got that part? Okay, so, now, as various immigrant groups increased the religious diversity of the colonies, the governments gradually changed their policies on tax-supported churches. So that should make sense. The more immigrants you get and the more diverse immigrants you get, we're starting to think, okay, there's more religious diversity. It's harder to have the government taxes supporting the church. In Massachusetts and Connecticut, by the time of the Revolution, so if we go to 1776, right, 1775, and just before, in these places, in Massachusetts and Connecticut, members of other established religions were exempt from supporting the Congregational Church. So, now all of a sudden, if you are, in these regions up here, by the time of the Revolution, you're exempt from paying these church taxes if you're a member of a different church. Some direct tax support remained until the 1800s. In Virginia, all tax support for the Anglican Church ended shortly after the Revolution. That should make sense. This is a less religious region of America in general. Essentially right after the Revolutionary War, you don't get taxes funding the church. Here, you do still have some taxes supporting into the early 1800s, okay? Then, Anglicans. So now I'm going to talk about them. These Anglicans. Colonial members of the Church of England tended to be prosperous farmers and merchants in New York and plantation owners in Virginia and the Carolinas. Okay? One of the big sects of the Anglican Church that's going to come out of this area is the Baptist Church. Do you get it? Okay. So let me say that again. Colonial members of the Church of England tended to be prosperous farmers and merchants in New York or plantation owners in Virginia and the Carolinas. There was no Anglican bishop in America to ordain ministers. The absence, you don't have to know that though, the absence of such leadership hampered the church's development. Because the Church of England was headed by the king, it was viewed as a symbol of English control of the colonies. All right? Any questions on that? Congregationalists. Yeah, Brendan.
So would you say piety decreases because of immigration?
Yes. Well...
Because the conditions are like...
So the question is, does piety decrease because of immigration? Sort of. Immigration indirectly kind of causes piety to decrease because immigration causes more religious diversity. The more religious diversity means that there's more... what it does is it's not necessarily it declines piety, it declines it increases separation of church and state, governments and supporting the church. Because there's so much religious diversity. And the more religious diversity that you have, maybe the less entrenched a religion or a sect of a religion can have in a society. The big factor in the declining religiousness or piety of the colonies, I would say, has to do with the circumstances in America as far as economy, westward movement, the whole... the American experience is a very individual type experience for many Americans. But that's a complex question. It's a great question. Hopefully you never have to write about that. Congregationalists. The Congregationalists were the successors to the Puritans. They are the successors to the Puritans. Successors to the Puritans. They were mainly found in New England, and Protestant critics of this church thought its ministers were domineering and its doctrine overly complex. So they thought the ministers were kind of like almost like tyrants, right? Dictator-like, I guess you could say. They were very commanding, the ministers were. All right? So, Great Awakening. Now we're going to talk about the Great Awakening. Here it is. That was all pretext. Did that help a little bit, though? Like, the two church... Okay. Yeah, Connor.
What years were the Puritanism height?
1600s. Yep. And you start seeing... So when you really start seeing the fall of it is by the mid to late 1600s. That whole halfway covenant thing, you're seeing the Puritans start to have troubles. And then when you get to the Salem witch trials, people are like, oh my gosh, those crazy Puritans they're freaking burning people at the stakes. What nuts? They're nuts. Because of some people that are claiming to be witches or whatever.
Accused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, being accused. Did I say claiming? Yeah. Anyways. So, in the first decades of the 18th century, so now we're not quite to the Great Awakening, but this is the immediate years before, sermons in Protestant churches tended to be long intellectual speeches and portrayed God as a benign creator of a perfectly ordered universe. There was less emphasis, and this should make sense. You get less piety in the New England region as you go from 1620 on into 1700. Less and less and less of this strict piety. There was less emphasis than in Puritan times on human sinfulness and the perils of damnation. You're not afraid. You're not being taught religion by fear. It's more of like, well, try and be good. And God is this benign creator that has ordered the universe perfectly. And this also parallels kind of the Enlightenment wave that's going to go on in the 1700s. I mean, we see more and more of this throughout the Enlightenment in Europe. The Enlightenment has a huge effect on colonial America. So, in the 1730s, however, a dramatic change occurred that swept through the colonies with the force of a hurricane. That's a little exaggerated from this book, but it's a pretty big movement. This was the Great Awakening. It was characterized by, here's the words that you should associate with the Great Awakening: a fervent or strong, F-E-R-V-E-N-T, fervent or strong expressions of religious feeling among masses of people. The movement peaks during the 1730s and 40s. The Great Awakening had a profound effect on religious practice in the colonies. Sinners tearfully confessed their guilt and then joyously exulted in being saved. Emotionalism became a common part of Protestant services. Ministers lost some of their former authority among those who now studied the Bible in their own homes, right? So it's this more of an individual religious experience as opposed to a communal or a more, congregational religious experience. That doesn't mean no one's going to church anymore, but religion is kind of becoming more of an individual experience. So, the Great Awakening is characterized by these like revivals where you just have like these huge gatherings of people and people preaching. The two people that you need to know, the two big ones, Jonathan Edwards, do you guys know him? Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. I'm going to read about both these guys for you. Jonathan Edwards was in a congregational church in Northampton, Massachusetts. Initiated the Great Awakening with a series of sermons, notably called The Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. This is 1741. Invoking Old Testament scriptures, Edwards argued that God was rightfully angry with human sinfulness. He's saying, like, God is angry with how much piety has declined in the colonies. Each individual who expressed deep penitence could be saved by God's grace, but the souls who paid no heed to God's commandments would suffer eternal damnation. Whitefield. Edwards' influence was largely limited to the New England colonies. So Edwards is largely the New England colonies. Another preacher, George Whitefield, came from England in 1739, and he traveled from one end of colonial America to the other. George Whitefield's a traveling colonial preacher. He gave rousing sermons on the hellish torments of the damned. Again, we're invoking this fear. He preached in barns, tents, fields, sometimes attracting an audience of 10,000 people. He stressed that God was all-powerful and would save only those who openly professed belief in Jesus Christ. Those who did not would be cast into hell. He taught that ordinary people who had faith and sincerity could understand the Christian Gospels without depending on ministers to lead them. Again, more of that emphasis on individual experience, repenting and professing your true belief is the only way to salvation, and the rest are damned to hell. So, the Great Awakening caused a major division within the churches, such as the Congregational and Presbyterian, between those supporting its teachings and those condemning it. So basically you have, like with any movement, right? You have people that are like, yeah, this Great Awakening, these preachers are spot on, they're dead on, and people are like, no, these guys are crazy. These are the difference between the new lights and the old lights, is what they're called. I don't think you guys got to know about them. I wouldn't worry about them that much. A big takeaway of the Great Awakening is it results in more religious diversity. A huge effect of the Great Awakening is more religious diversity. This is where you're going to get the Baptists and Methodists that are going to come out in the South. Political influence. The Great Awakening also influenced colonial politics. Unlike anything before it, the movement affected every social class in all sections of the colonies. In one sense, it is one of the first movements in which colonial members living all throughout the colonies at the time, they had a shared experience. It kind of fosters a colonial identity. So the Great Awakening in some ways fosters an early colonial identity. Does that make sense? I'm going to say it one more time. The Great Awakening helps to foster an early colonial identity. It also, because it's emphasizing the experience of individuals, right? It also, in a way, indirectly begins to change the way people look at authority. It kind of promotes democracy in a way, in an indirect way. I wouldn't. That's kind of a tough argument to make. Okay.
Did it have any changes like with slavery?
No. And that's the thing is that another thing you should think of, Anglicans, right? These are going to be more often slave owners. Congregationalists are going to be more opposed to slavery, just because of the. Yeah, and it's part of you don't need slaves in the North because you're not growing tobacco and then increasingly cotton. Yeah.
And wasn't the Second Great Awakening was more abolitionist?
There are going to be the roots of abolitionist sentiments in the Second Great Awakening. I'm going to read about that in just a second. Yeah.
So the First Great Awakening goes from less piety, and then as it goes on, it gets more and more.
So here's what it is. That's great. Let me just summarize this all together. Since the founding of Plymouth in 1620, you have a slow progression of less and less and less piety, less religiousness. And then by the 1700s, early 1700s, 1720s, and 30s, you have this resurgence in religiousness, but it looks and feels different than the religiousness before it. this new resurgence of religiousness is going to be led by Great Awakening preachers like Whitefield, and Edwards, and they're going to say, they're emphasizing more religiousness, but at an individual level, right? Individual religiousness in which you're repenting for your sins, you are claiming your belief in Jesus Christ, and that salvation comes through this act of deep regret and admitting of your sins, and those who do not profess these beliefs are going to hell. So, does that answer your question? Okay. All right, should we read about Second Great Awakening quickly? I know you guys are we don't have to be here too much longer. I'll be here as long as you guys want me to be here, but I don't want to keep you forever. Okay, good. Now we're going to read about the Second Great Awakening. 202 to 204. Here we go. You ready? Second Great Awakening? Okay. All right. So, the Second Great Awakening was through the early decades of the 1800s, or the early decades of the 19th century. Okay. So, Second Great Awakening is the early decades of the 1800s. One of the influences, why the Second Great Awakening is going to occur, a big influencer is the Enlightenment. So as the Enlightenment, which really takes hold in the 1750s in Europe, and we borrow a lot of Enlightenment philosophy in our own Constitution. Do you guys know that? Like, our founding fathers really studied Enlightenment philosophers and read their books. People like John Locke. Have you heard of John Locke? People like Montesquieu and Rousseau, and these people that are writing about, Enlightenment. And then there's the more scientific end of it, when we're starting to really start to understand more about our universe and the stars. And Benjamin Franklin was huge into science. He was a very smart individual, inventor.
So were some of the founding fathers actual Enlightenments?
Not so much. They were more. They were part of the Enlightenment age, but they are not like writing extensively. It's hard. So the Enlightenment's when you talk about Enlightenment, you're talking about Europe. But Enlightenment ideas transferred to the United States, and then we kind of took and ran with them. In a way, our Constitution, our government, is a product of Enlightenment philosophy. All of a sudden, that governments, the Enlightenment era, I think this is a really interesting time period, actually. It's kind of boring because you get to read that language that's written is terribly boring. But the whole idea in the Enlightenment era, as far as politics goes, is this understanding of what's the purpose of governments. That governments are derived from the consent of the governed. And it's this push against this, it's a pushback against rule by an absolute tyrannist or dictator, a despotic. It's against this despotic rule and more towards people have to accept and this is democracy. The ideas of democracy and American democracy are written in the pages of guys like John Locke. If you take a look at Locke's writing, Jefferson plagiarizes John Locke like crazy in the Declaration of Independence. I'm dead serious. If you read the second treatise on government from John Locke, Jefferson plagiarizes the crap out of him. So bad, like word for word. The only thing he changes is he changes like the first line, life, liberty. Governments are derived from the consent of the governed, and among these basic rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It just said life, liberty, and property in John Locke's. It's right there. It's crazy if you line them up side by side. Jefferson plagiarized the crap out of them. Yeah.
This is also the age of reason, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is the father of the Constitution.
No, Madison.
Oh.
Madison. No, it's okay. That's a good thing to ask. It's Madison. All right, so let me read you guys about the Second Great Awakening, okay? Can I just read can I give you the background of before the Second Great Awakening quickly?
Yeah.
All right. Hear this out because this is a good thing. So, who becomes president in 1828? It's an important election. Jackson. That's an important election. So we're kind of just to root it in where we're at from the American experience. The Second Great Awakening is kind of taking hold in the early parts of this time period. Jackson in 1828 is going to be there. Another important person is 1840. We get the first Whig elected. Not that he's important because he dies immediately. No.
Henry Harrison.
William Henry Harrison. All right. So anyways, the period before the Civil War is also known as what period? Period before the Civil War.
Antebellum.
Antebellum. Do you guys remember that word? Antebellum. He's been studying probably. Let me write that word up here again. All right, antebellum. Okay, period before the Civil War, also known as the antebellum. During this time, a diverse mix of reformers dedicated themselves to several different causes. One of these causes, I'm going to give you an example of a couple of them. Establishing free public schools. So, one of the things that are going to come about in the early 1800s, we're talking 18, talking the time period basically from 1820 through 1860.
This is the background?
Yeah, it's the background.
You said the Second Great Awakening was the early 1800s.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about this is what I'm reading about is other reforms going on in this time period. So the Second Great Awakening takes place in this context. What else is going on while the Second Great Awakening is taking hold? I misspoke. I did say background. You're right. Okay, so one of these types of reforms is public schools, a push for public schools or tax-supported public schools. Improving the treatment of the mentally ill. That's a small one. Controlling or abolishing the sale of liquor and beer. This is where the roots of the temperance movement are coming into play. Winning equal legal and political rights for women. This is like the Seneca Falls Conference. This is where women... Remember how I said the Second Great Awakening serves as a jumping point for women to start, demanding more... rights and equality. And then the other one, which we talked about, is abolishing slavery. The abolitionist movement kind of comes out of this as well. Okay. Perhaps the most important of all these reforms were the powerful religious motives behind the reformers' zeal. So here we go. Religious revivals swept through the United States during the early decades of the 1800s. These religious revivals. They were partly a reaction against the rationalism that had been the fashion during the Enlightenment and American Revolution. So they're partly a reaction to the belief in human reason, this whole age of reason. So we talked about this. They're kind of fueled by this Enlightenment period. Puritan teachings of original sin and predestination. Do you guys know that term predestination? Some people are just born, destined to go to heaven, and others are born destined to go to hell. Had been rejected by believers in a more liberal and forgiving doctrine, such as those of the Unitarian Church. Calvinism, which also embraces Puritan teachings, Calvinism began a counterattack against these liberal views in the 1790s. So you get this more liberal view of embracing Enlightenment views, a very nice God, versus the Calvinist views, which are more Puritan-rooted. Calvinism began a counterattack against these liberal views in the 1790s. The Second Great Awakening began among educated people, such as Reverend Timothy Dwight, D-W-I-G-H-T, who was the president of Yale College in Connecticut. Dwight's campus revivals motivated a generation of young men to become evangelical preachers. So essentially, the Second Great Awakening is rooted in combating the more liberal, soft views that are going to be embraced by Enlightenment thinkers and the religion, the more nice, soft religion that comes out of the Enlightenment. Does that make sense? So it's a reaction to this. However, it's looking for the thing. It's going to be shaking. By the way, Brandon, I tried to fix that. I think I might have done it for the last video I uploaded. We'll see. I tried to change the settings. However, in revivals of the early 1800s, successful preachers were audience-centered and easily understood by the uneducated. They offered the opportunity for salvation to all, and these populist movements seemed attuned to the democratization of American society. So these are revivalist movements that are spreading through the country, and I'm going to go through a couple of them, and we'll make sure we understand them together. We'll be done with this. So revivalism in New York. In 1823, this is a person that you might see as a multiple choice question on an AP exam. A Presbyterian minister named Charles Finney, F-I-N-N-Y, just remember F-I-N-N-Y, Finney, started a series of revivals in upstate New York. Many New Englanders had settled there. Instead of delivering sermons based on rational argument, Finney appealed to people's emotions and fear of damnation and persuaded thousands to publicly declare their revived faith. He preached that all were free to be saved through faith and hard work, ideas that strongly appealed to the rising middle class. Because of Finney's influence, Western New York became known as the burned-over district for its frequent hell and brimstone revivals. Okay? Burned-over district, New York. Finney. Burned over district, New York. Baptists and Methodists. In the South and on the advancing western frontier. So this is the South and the frontier. Do you guys know what I mean by frontier? Let me draw this out real quick. Yeah, it's essentially the West. How's that, better?
Well, you forgot about California and Michigan.
You forgot about this. So, the frontier is the furthest point that Americans have migrated to. Okay, that's what I mean by the frontier. And by 1900, the frontier has closed. That's at the Frederick Jackson Turner thesis, the frontier, the closing of the frontier. It's in the 1890s.
Is there like a certain line that's after the Mississippi?
It depends. You mean right at this point?
Yeah.
1820s. You are. It depends on what you call settled, but this is. So the Louisiana Purchase happens in 1803. Three.
Yeah.
So you are. Missouri is going. The Missouri Compromise happens in 1820. So probably the Missouri is going to be that starting of the frontier. All right, Baptists and Methodists in the South and on the advancing western frontier. Baptist and Methodist circuit preachers, and this is another guy you should know, such as Peter Cartwright, C-A-R-T-W-R-I-G-H-T, Peter Cartwright, would travel from one location to another to attract thousands to hear their dramatic preaching and outdoor revival meetings. They converted many of the unchurched into respectable church members or members of the church community. By 1850, the Baptists and the Methodists had become the largest Protestant denominations in the country. Let me say that again. By 1850, Baptists and Methodists are the largest Protestant denominations in the country. Another religious group to come out of this time period in the 1830s is Mormons. So 1830s is Mormons. Who founds the Mormon religion in the 1830s? Smith. Do you remember him? Joseph Smith. And the guy who really leads the Mormon movement and helps it flourish out in Utah is Brigham Young. Do you remember him? BYU.
That's what I put on the test and said Joseph Smith.
Phil Brigham
I know
Young.
this, one of those.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So, the Second Great Awakening, like the first, caused new divisions in society between the newer evangelical sects and the older Protestant churches. It affected all sections of the country. It was only in northern states from Massachusetts westward to Ohio that the Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, played a significant role in social reform. So the Second Great Awakening does not cause social reform so much in the South. It's mostly in the New England region and in the Western, what we're going to call like the Chestnut Belt. Activist religious groups provided both the leadership and well-organized voluntary societies that drove the reform movements of the antebellum era. So let's read this one more time. The Second Great Awakening was partially a reaction to the rationalism or belief in human reason that had been fashioned during the Enlightenment and American Revolution. Calvinist teachings of the original sin and predestination had been rejected by believers of the Enlightenment in more liberal and forgiving doctrines, such as those of the Unitarian Church. The Calvinist people who were like, this is ridiculous that religions become so nice and fluffy. Calvinists began a counterattack on these liberal views in the 1790s. The Second Great Awakening began among educated people in the Connecticut, New England region, and it looked different depending on where you are. These Calvinist preachers are people like Finney, Cartwright, and are going to be giving these revival meetings in which they are more evangelical. People are publicly renouncing, their sin and becoming saved, right? The saving conversion. What did I say?
No.
You can tell me. Make fun of me.
I'm just making fun of
Oh, okay.
You know what he said, so I don't know what he said.
I wrote it years to death.
Anyways. All right. Mormonism comes out of this. Do you guys know that the Mormons, the official religion of Mormons, is the Church of...
Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, there you go. Church of Latter-day Saints. Good. I just watched the other day the episode, the South Park episode on Mormonism. Do you guys ever see that?
What?
The South Park episode on Mormons? It's interesting. I can't recommend it. I would never recommend that to you guys, ever.
Every once in a while, the crash course is something like appropriate will happen. It's really like you can't know it.
I know. All right. First and Second Great Awakenings. Does that kind of explain them?
Yeah.
At least it puts it in the time period.